Welcome, everybody, back to the channel. I'm Mike Jones, retired rap artist. I don't look the same as I did in my music videos all those years ago, but this is what the wear and tear of parenthood does to you, ladies and gentlemen. But yes, I am Mike Jones. I run Inspiring Philosophy, and I'm here with a friend of mine, Kenneth Vaughan. How you doing today?
Good, man. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah. We had you on a year or so ago, and everyone complained they couldn't hear you because your mic sucked. So I got you a new mic so that you will sound much better now. Therefore, problem fixed.
Awesome, man. I appreciate the swag.
Yeah, awesome. So I've been wanting to have him on for a while because we've been wanting to look at the debate that Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor did on Unbelievable. And I've been busy, so it kept getting put off, yada, yada, yada. But here we are. We're finally getting to it. After all these months of trying to get that set up, we're finally here. So, Kenneth, tell everybody a little bit about yourself, why you're here, your background, your credentials.
Sure. My name's Kenneth Vaughan. I'm a sociologist. I focus on the sociology of religion and political sociology. I love the sociology of religion. It's fun to talk about. I got my bachelor's degree, my first master's at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I went on to do a PhD at Baylor University. I worked for 3 years as an assistant professor in residence at the University of Connecticut. I spent 1 year at the University of Central Oklahoma, and then I earned what I guess is like the platinum trophy of academia, and that's getting a job in your hometown. So I'm back at a small liberal arts college in the San Antonio metro, and just having a blast and getting ready to teach sociology of religion here in the fall and some other courses. I had been sent this debate involving Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro about whether or not religion is good for society by a couple of people, and asked for my comments on it. And I think kind of in my circles, I think they had an interesting debate. They touched on some interesting points, but there was a complaint that this is a sociological question, and the debate itself wasn't sociological enough. So rather than kind of cheering for one side or the other, I've kind of reviewed this a couple of times in my head and written some notes down, and I'm thinking about okay, what would elevate this discussion, and what would make this something that's more of an agreeable, sociological topic for something, regardless of who you think performed well in the debate. And I think I'll talk about where I think each side had strengths and weaknesses, but that's kind of how I came to this topic.
So why are you a sociopath? According to Tim here, he says you're so no, it's a sociologist, okay? A social scientist, okay?
Just you're like who? Like DW?
Like David Wood.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I am, but I'm only professionally a sociologist. So I will answer questions here in the capacity of professional sociologist, but not in the capacity of sociopath, whether or not that's true.
Yeah. So I've already had people tell me you're not a real scientist, but you are a bona fide sociologist. Therefore, you're a scientist. Therefore, you're qualified to review this and offer a scientific, in a sociological sense, perspective on this debate and everything that's going on. And, I'm not a sociologist. I love sociology. I read a ton of stuff on it. And then when I am worried I'm getting something wrong, I'll email either you or Jay. I forget his last name. It starts with an M. You know who I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's his last name again? Yeah. I'll email you or him. He's a psychologist, but yeah, just to make sure I'm on the right track here. So when I saw the debate, I was rather annoyed. The first half hour is really annoying. They're just talking about free will, and I'm like, this isn't a debate. This is on whether or not religion is good for society, because the question of free will is an entirely separate subject. I mean, have a debate on that. But as you said, this is a sociological debate. This should be an empirical question. Right. We can look at empirical studies to see if religion is good for society or not. And the problem I see is a lot in the atheist community, a lot, especially recently. They don't treat it as a sociological question. They do armchair sociology or armchair psychology. They go around and go, I think Christianity creates a slave morality. Therefore, it's harmful. Okay, we can look at studies to see if Christianity leads to a slave morality. Not a lot of evidence to support that. But if you're going to have a debate on whether or not religion is good for society, you should bring up the sociological aspect and look at studies in sociology, see what the results are, because this is an empirical question. Right. You don't know about, I don't know if you know about this, but there's a whole new field, just kind of came up in the past decade or a little bit over, called experimental philosophy. Well, they're starting to do, philosophers are doing surveys on laymen to see what their intuitions really are. Because for a long time, philosophers assumed they just had the right intuitions on things. And they're finding out a lot of lay people don't have the same intuitions professional philosophers do. So, I think that's a really cool idea. And I'm glad they're doing that. I just, if you're going to, we need to take that further. If we're going to have a sociological debate, it needs to be treated empirically. And that really didn't come up in this debate, unfortunately.
Yeah, I felt that it seemed like what O'Connor does, and what I think most people acknowledge he does well, is like debate, theology and the existence of God. And I kind of felt the specter of that debate kind of, let's take what we've been doing for a while in that era and in that area and try and repackage that toward the is it good for society question. But they were going back to, free will, and is that expected on theism or atheism? Is the Bible moral, and does God exist? And yeah, I think a lot of us in sociology have thoughts on that, but ultimately what we're doing is not an existence of God question. It's now philosophers may want to take what we do and talk about that, and that would be kind of interesting if they did. But ultimately, and it's interesting how that debate fell along those lines, because I was thinking about this on the drive over. Like, okay, like if I were to kind of pick the most like kind of pro-religion, anti-religion scholars or whatever, it's kind of hard to even think in those terms, right? It's just more of like, what does religion do in a certain context? And I'm thinking, what about research that reflects positively and negatively? And I'm thinking there's a loose correlation maybe between what the people like advocate for personally, but like some of the most like kind of look at religion, like helping people in terms of health and social cohesion. Like these are very non-religious people doing a lot of this research. And when I think of like Christian nationalism research, which has really shown like where religion can be a social problem, this has been spearheaded by like seminarians and evangelicals, right? Like in the discipline. So I think what little psychoms I can do here, or not psychoms, if I'm not a scientist, that's fine. I don't use that term very often, but would be like, hey, we can talk about this, and like your religion is not at stake, or your position as a non-religious person is not at stake either, right? Like, if I have time, I'll share some history with that. But that's what I found very liberating about the sociology of religion. I'm a relatively non-confrontational person, but it lets me talk about religion with all kinds of people without usually getting into screaming matches.
Yeah. And so someone said, to be fair, Ben's point was that religion promotes belief in free will, which is good for society. I mean, it depends. That was another problem I had with the first half of the debate, is that some religions do, not all do. I mean, you'll have a lot of the sects in Islam that don't. You have a big strain of Christianity, which is the Calvinist tradition, which pushes against that in a lot of ways. There are some Calvinists that do believe in free will, sure, but it was just sort of assumed that religion promotes free will. Not necessarily. So that's why the first half of the debate felt like just missing the whole point. What was your take on the first half of the debate?
Yeah,
and then
get into that now.
You'll get into that now. Then we'll play some sections of the debate. And if you guys have super chats for us, you please send them in. We'll get to them as we go through this. If you have questions about if an atheist has brought up an argument like, well, they say religion is harmful in this way, or it causes war, or it causes violence. We'll get to that as well. So if you want to put super chats in, we'll get to that.
Yeah, so we kind of agreed to skip the first 30 minutes where they're going on about free will, and that was the main issue, right? Like, I don't, and as we've discussed, I don't think it's incredibly pertinent to the question of whether or not religion is good for society, but it's been about 30 minutes or so on the topic. Ben Shapiro had made his opening statement saying that basically he argued that all of our lives rely on like faith principles, and one of those was like, I guess, like free will, and he spends a lot of time on that issue and says that we, to be like functioning members of society, so that's where he makes the social argument briefly, need to believe that we can make a difference in the world, that our choices matter, which free will enables. We also need to believe in right and wrong and other things. So Ben is asserting this, and Alex O'Connor basically responds with like, so what? If we don't have free will, still evolution has brought us to a place where it feels like and we act like we do. And I didn't want to gloss over this part without getting Alex credit here, because I'll probably disagree with him later. But I think he's basically right about this. Like, consistency of thought, like the sort of things that philosophers are asking, like that's great philosophical research, but for like how your average person lives their day-to-day life doesn't really matter here, right? Like it's actually quite rare that somebody's going to sit around, think out systematically, well, if I don't have free will, is there any justification for punishing people? Is there any, you know what I mean? Like, that's just not where most people are. And actually, most professional philosophers I am aware of who deny free will still kind of have an out clause to say, yes, we can still punish people for doing wrong. We can still have prisons. We can still, you know what I mean? So like, I think it just doesn't really affect things here. I'll touch on a couple of sociological points that I think we can tease from this, and we can move on to the clips. Like what they're kind of teasing out is what Ann Swidler called like a deductive cultural logic, where people based on their background would give like a sound and valid syllogism for how they should live their life based on all of their religious or cultural commitments. And she notes it's quite rare. Mark Chaves gave a great presidential address at that, I think it was at SSR a couple of decades ago, on what's called the religious congruence fallacy, which presupposes that religious beliefs and attitudes and religious beliefs and behaviors will always fall in line, right? I mean, I wish that were the case. I wish it were the case that every Christian who read love your neighbor as yourself, and who is my neighbor? It's that ethno-religious outsider who you think you're better than, but you're not. Like, if every Christian in the world who read that lived that out, it'd be a much better planet, right? But like, there are incongruences between our beliefs and actions. Similarly, if like every skeptic who believed in, the religious pluralism that secularization is supposed to bring us lived that out, those countries would be utopian, right? But like, most people are complicated. We're religious, or we're not religious, but we're not only religious or only not religious. So I think that Alex is basically correct in saying whether or not this lines up philosophically doesn't really matter. Most people are not kind of living out this kind of nihilistic fear that you think this is going to lead to. And if it logically leads to it, whatever. I'm not a philosopher. I can't tell you that. But what Alex taps into is this idea of disenchantment, which is foundational to sociology, that secularization can happen when we get secular, whether they're right or wrong, whether they're sensible or not. If we have a secular mechanism that replaces something that religion did for us, we live that way. We live as if it's true. And yeah, most people live as if we have free will. And that just is true. So in terms of how it affects society, that I don't think there's much of a controversy there. And if I'm not scoring points, but I agreed with Alex there. I think way much too much time.
Yeah,
too much on it, but I agree.
I think the first half, Alex took that for sure. Ben should have just stayed away from that. Was completely irrelevant to the topic. It was really just weird to even bring up in this debate. Luke Bowman, thank you for the super chat. He says, favorite line in the newest Lutheran satire video. Have you seen that one?
No, okay. I remember they did a Christmas one years ago.
No, they did a recent one called "Is This Christian Nationalism?" and they did a game show where these guests have to guess if something. So maybe here, Luke, I'm going to save your super chat. If we have time at the end, I will play some of that video for Kenneth to get his reaction, because it is quite hilarious. Okay. My favorite part is the hosts, because sometimes that's how I feel, because the way that Christian nationalism is defined in sociology is not how any of the lay people are defining it, and it's rather annoying. So we will come back at the end if we have time, and we'll take a look at that. If we'll see. All right, let me put up the debate here, and let's play some of the later sections, because there's some more interesting stuff they get into later. It was like, finally. So here's the debate. We're at the 28-minute mark, and so let me just pull this up.
The religions of the world are false. I think that they are incorrect. That is, I don't think there really is a supernatural authority. And what that means is that the inventions of religious morality are just those inventions, and inventions of a human mind. Now, if you have a human morality that recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on a planet, then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God, there's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community, but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me, because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe. Therefore, if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system in the dictates, allegedly, of the creator of the universe is all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults of nihilism and human invented morality, with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
So, all right, real quick, let me just make sure we're on the same track. So Alex is basically arguing like, okay, yeah, if a secularist come and he wants to kill me, what could I do to really convince him? You appeal to God, hell, heaven, these kinds of things. But then he says, well, what if a religious person thinks that God has told him that he should go out and kill someone? There's even less, Alex says, that he could do. Right. So do you want to comment on that, or do you want me to play Ben Shapiro's response? Because I think Ben has a pretty good response we can build up on. I
guess the only thing I would say about that right now, and then we can look at Ben's response and kind of comment on all of this collectively, is I would actually kind of lean into Alex's logic earlier in the debate in what are people actually doing, right? Like, I don't think that, I mean, that's a description of abnormal psychology, that like God has spoken to me to kill someone apropos of absolutely nothing. So I would kind of lean into what he was saying earlier about maybe even the subjectivity or like a potential falseness of a belief. I guess, I don't know, I could try to convince the person God doesn't want them to kill me, but if they believed me, and I don't think there are many religions out there that genuinely teach that like their gods want them to kill someone apropos of nothing. Now, under other circumstances, religion can be involved in conflict, but I don't know exactly what he's talking about here.
Well,
I would like to lean into the point about practical living. What do people do? And it's usually not approach strangers on the street to kill them.
Right. It's a weird argument because it's just like two hypotheticals. It doesn't tell us whether or not religion itself is good or bad for society just because you have these hypotheticals. It doesn't really get us anywhere. Let's listen to a little bit of Ben's response, and then we'll comment. I'm going to put up some slides after that as well.
Okay. So many things there, and so much that you're saying is quite brilliant. I actually thought you were.
I'm not sure about that, but go ahead.
Going in a different direction with that last example, which I'll explain in a second. So, yeah, to start with the very beginning, obviously, the idea of right and wrong. So there are many problems with the motivism. Alistair McIntyre does a good job sort of breaking down the problems with the motivism. But the sort of idea that there have to be certain moral absolutes that are beyond contention, and those moral absolutes have to be universally accepted. You can ground that, I suppose, in a sort of descriptive universe. The problem is that, to go back to your example, which again I think is a really interesting one, if a man comes to kill me, I think the real question of religion versus non-religion in the utility sphere here is it more likely that a man is going to come to kill you being a devotee of a religion that says that he must kill you? Or is it more likely that a man is going to kill you out of self-interest because he is not a devotee of a God who says that killing is wrong? So if you are faced with these two alternatives, to kind of remove your example one step, the question is why the man has come to kill you. I mean, that's your premise is the man has come to kill you because God told him to, and so he can't be dissuaded by force. Agreed. We see that full scale in the real world on a fairly regular basis. It is also true that over the course of human history, men have come to kill one another on the basis of self-interest in extraordinary amounts of the time. Tribal self-interest, particularly, having no particular relationship with God, just the idea that I want to kill you over territory, I want to kill you over resources, I want to kill you because you're not a member of my immediate kin family, or because you killed a member of my kin family, and so in revenge, I need to kill a member of your kin family. The entire, to borrow from your language, the entire sort of evolution of religion on a utility basis would have been to create moral absolutes that are applicable more broadly than to you and your friends. Any morality that can be created on an individual level is inherently dangerous because you can immediately graft that morality onto your personal self-interest. The entire
all right, I think we played enough to get the idea. And here, just to sort of summarize what I think Ben is getting at here. He's talking about how this plays out practically in reality. I like the point he said here about what's more likely: someone's going to come and kill you because they think God told them, or that they just have some aspect of self-interest. And that's going to be the majority of the murders that happen. It's not crazy people that think they've heard voices. Most people kill other people, commit homicide out of self-interest, like a jaded lover, somebody who wants money, somebody who's robbing a store, these kinds of things. And I think that's an important point. Just because we can think up a crazy person who thinks God told him to go kill people, that doesn't mean that's the standard thing that happens in religion, or that religion somehow causes that mentality. There's no evidence it necessarily does. There's very little evidence that it does, actually. So it's a very weird argument for Alex to make, as if that's somehow going to show religion is harmful. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we're still kind of operating within kind of, I think, an unhelpful hypothetical. So,
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I mean, I yeah, agree with the point that someone's going to try to kill me out of self-interest more than because they heard a voice. But ultimately, does that still tell me much about like the role of religion in society? I don't think so, right? Like these,
no.
Even in relative, like moderately high crime areas of the U.S., the individual odds that one person gets murdered are quite low. But there are myriad other ways where religion and secularization have influence over the rest of our lives. I find that we'll get more into this. I find that both of them have issues with subjective and objective, that they both kind of play both sides of that when it's convenient, I think, and maybe not knowingly. But I think, again, that's kind of, for them, I think it's like their kind of philosophical approach rubbing against the real world, that in philosophy, you are often looking for like, what is the truth of the matter? A great endeavor in philosophy. But when you're trying to understand what confused, busy, conflicted people do, you don't have that religious congruence, right? And so I found it wasn't the most helpful example. Ben's going to get into this, and I think Alex had one of his stronger points earlier. One of the stronger points that I think Ben is going to get into is when he talks about religious institutions and interpretation. So Alex is talking about like, well, what happens when religion kind of rubs up against the real world? I think this is a feature more than a bug of religion. So, he's talking to Ben Shapiro, who's Jewish, right? Like Judaism, for example, has centuries of rabbinic commentary that for a lot of Jewish people carries religious authority, right? A lot of these are predicated on like when Judaism throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, faces a previously understudied or new social problem, and how do we solve it today? But that is the religion itself. I've done a lot of work in the sociology of Islam and Islamophobia and things like that. And in Islam, you have doctrines like ijtihad and the ijma, and even some ramifications of the ummah that allow for like interpretation based on context and context over time, right? Like, yes, every religion, Christianity too, has like fundamentalist movements who try to resist that. All of them badly, I would argue. They usually are just kind of lost in their own irony about their current like cultural moment too. But in general, like Christianity has, especially like in the kind of higher churches, right? Like you have a pope who can interpret things in the given moment. And I don't think that's Catholicism playing catch up. I don't think that's Catholic coping, right? That is the nature of traditional Catholicism, that like if the Pope speaks about this current issue, and the Pope can like speak about evolution, right? And say it's okay for Catholics to believe in evolution. It's okay for Catholics to believe in aliens, the previous Pope said, right? Like that, I don't think, even like more conservative, like Pentecostal traditions have like, the Spirit is speaking today, right? And whether we agree with these messages or not, I think rubbing up against the real world is actually something that religion does. It's inherent to the religion. I don't think it's necessarily religion secularizing. There are examples of religion secularizing and acquiescing, but it isn't necessarily that. Yeah.
Let me share my screen here because I just wanted to bring up some research on this. So like the idea, I mean, if we're talking about what are the odds of a man who's religious, who's going to come kill you because he thinks God told you, I'd say that's going to be exceptionally rare. I mean, meta-analytical research shows that religiosity and mental health are positively correlated or positively associated. You're more likely to have good mental health if you're religious, and numerous studies in these meta-analyses has found that. We also see evidence that religion is associated with more self-control. This is a very interesting review that talks about a lot of research that covers that and shows that, yes, there's strong evidence for religiosity being positively related to self-control, as well as agreeableness, conscientiousness. Other research shows religion corresponds with lower levels of direct and indirect aggression. Intrinsic religiosity facilitates an increase in self-control. Greater religiosity was associated with higher levels of compassion and self-control. So here's another quote I like, because they cite a bunch of papers here. They note religiosity is hypothesized to decrease crime by increasing fear of punishment, conventional bonds, and self-control. Gottfredson and Hirschi and decreasing negative emotional reactions to strains, as well as deviant deviations in peer associations. Previous studies in their synthesis via systematic reviews and meta-analyses provide empirical support for this hypothesis. So we see a lot of evidence that actually religiosity would be a really good thing if you want to prevent someone from having poor mental health and thinking that God is telling them to go around and kill people. You're going to get more self-control. You're going to get better mental health, lower levels of depression, lower levels of aggression. these kinds of things. So that would be a better way to see how religion plays out in society. If you have this hypothetical that Alex brought up about what is religion, could religion cause this type of thing? All right, well, let's see what the research shows us. All right, the research shows it'd be very unlikely for these kinds of things to happen. So what's more likely? Someone's going to want to kill you out of self-interest or because of religious motivators? Well, not going to be the religious motivators from what we can gather. That can happen, but it's going to be exceptionally rare.
Yeah, I know the mental health stuff. That self-control stuff is really interesting. I don't think I've seen that before. But with mental health, it kind of generally increases in religiosity have been associated with decreases in depressive symptoms. It's had anxiolytic effects and a lot of good. Now, the mechanisms are different for every for every mental health disorder. The thing I'm thinking of with like God told me to kill you is so generally, it could be like physiological health. People can have hallucinations like tumors and things like that. But like if somebody's having a very extreme form of schizophrenia, which just in the world of like stigma too, let's point out that most schizophrenics are not violent, do not have violent hallucinations or anything like that. But I guess in the minority of patients of schizophrenia or some other disorder that would cause hallucinations, if you like hear a voice that's telling you, that to kill people, you don't have a lot of scripts to work with, right? Like in either biologically or genetically, however this works, you're convinced that it's true. I mean, you have like God said it or aliens transmitted it to my mind or something like that. I think if anything, the hallucination comes first and the interpretation comes later. But I guess I would worry if there was any evidence that people are religious and then that creates delusions somehow, but it doesn't work that way, right? Like I think in very rare circumstances, somebody hears a voice, they're by the mechanisms of the disorder trying to figure out where is it coming from, and they have scripts and culture that give them very few options, and it's exceptionally rare too. It's important to just point out that like that's not what mental health problems do for most people too, because there's stigma out there that we should probably raise it.
There's no correlation there. That's the main problem, and so this doesn't at all show us religion is bad for society. Thank you for the super chat. They say thank you for your ministry. Thankful for your ministry. Do you think we will see Christianity go back to being an important part of Western civilization again in the near future? Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think sociologically speaking, based on birth rates, there's a great book by Kenneth Kaufman, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, where he just points out that based on birth rates, religious people are going to still be the majority in 100 years. So I think there will be some of that pushing more back in that direction. How long it will take, I don't know. We tend to go through these pendulum shifts where we go left or right, left or right. I think right now people are starting to see the pendulum go from the left and it's starting to move more to the right. That's going to take several decades, I think, though. But I think that's kind of where we're at. So I think we see these pendulum shifts. I think Christianity will. I think it still does play a very, very important role in civilization because as scholars like Tom Holland, Jacqueline Simpson have noted that a lot of the secular values that people hold to are sort of like the redheaded stepchild of Christianity. They come out of Christian civilization and they just sort of take what they like and build like a secular worldview. So it still is playing a very pivotal role, even if people don't realize it. What are your thoughts on this, Kenneth?
Well, projections are the hardest thing to do in the social sciences, and it's more of a demography question even. I think that secularization has, I think like that's kind of undeniable that in the West, like religion has been broadly speaking on the decline for several decades. I think that in the United States, we were kind of seen as a holdout for a while, and then in the 2000s we started experiencing declines as well that were like very notable. In the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of chatter about a potential slowdown in secularization in the United States. Now that doesn't mean it would reverse. It just means right now it's decreasing at a much lower pace. And there's a chart that's going around that shows like a 3% bump in the youth, but that's usually within a standard margin of error or something. I wouldn't make much of that. And I don't think we're going to know. I don't think we're going to know I'm not as convinced as like Ryan Burge that a few years of this is indicative of a trend. It could be. It's the start of it. I don't think we're going to know. The question I think we have is like, is there a bottom ceiling for secularization that it hits a certain point and then because like just once an alternative comes in to a society, mathematically, there are going to be more people who leave from one to the other. But the question is, how far will it go? Like, is it just kind of linear toward the eradication of religion? No, and every scholar who has ever predicted that has ended up with egg on their faces. But does it plummet to roughly half and half, or does it, given current trends, go to a quarter of the population? Now, I've seen the birth rate stats projections as well. All of those, that is something. Although that is something, right? Like religious people generally have higher birth rates than non-religious people. That might be changing. There's some early research. We don't know. I wouldn't say anything definitively, but that has historically been the main observation here. So what's going to move faster? And history happens, right? You'll have a society that has very kind of steady rates of religiosity, maybe minor declines. And then something like the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal happens and religion's down 20 points in Germany over the course of 3 years, right? Something could happen that raises the credibility of religion in times of national crisis, and then it's up 10% in a short period of time. So these are very loose. I wouldn't marry a prediction, but those are our two kind of competing mechanisms here, like the natural cultural secularization, and the birth rate goes in the other direction.
Yeah, and I think
long answer, I don't know.
I think we will. It is all speculation, but I do think that this growing trad movement is pushing people back towards religion, even if I don't agree with everything in that movement for sure. It's become the counterculture. People naturally just build a counterculture. Now that secularism has taken over, what's counterculture? Trad religious ideas. Okay, so that's just a natural result, and so that ends up pushing the pendulum back. And then when you get more of a trad religious culture, there'll be a growing counterculture of secularism, because we go through these pendulum shifts. We could be right back where we are in 100 years with the pendulum back on the left. You don't know. It depends on how long it takes for those shifts to happen.
Are those are the people with the anime profile pictures calling stupid things based, right?
Yes, basically. Well,
hopefully that doesn't become a mainstream representative of religion, but we'll see.
I don't think it will. A lot of religious people are pushing against that. Yeah,
but send me the angry one.
I'm a better philosopher. I do not think, therefore I do not am. From Sus Mike Jones. Well, much appreciated, Sus Mike Jones. You are definitely sus. I will give you that for sure. Thank you for the super chat, Larry. God has already instilled our sense of right and wrong in humanity. We can't put that toothpaste back in the bottle. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying. So God has already instilled our sense of right and wrong. We can't. So it's kind of like this idea that we have this sense of right and wrong that we get from, I think you're saying, from God. In a sociological perspective, you can make the case that a lot of what we think is right and wrong is going to come from a traditional Christian heritage of the West. This is the main thesis of Tom Holland's book, for example. So I think that's what you're getting at, and then we just can't undo that. I would agree. I don't think any secular society is ever going to get away from Christianity in the West. If it does, I think there would basically be societal collapse. But it depends on what you mean by that. If you're talking more about it in a sociological sense, or if you're talking about it more in an ontological sense.
That's interesting.
So
I mean, that's interesting. I guess so there's an observation that in terms of just the beliefs about what's right and wrong, that religious and non-religious people generally agree, except for where religion is directly pertinent. Should I kill people apropos of nothing, as you were just talking about? Generally, thankfully, most people agree no. Is it immoral to skip church on Sunday? Those are the sorts of issues where there's a big gap, right? Because it's directly, but what people do, to our earlier question, is quite different. I was talking to someone else working on their thesis on marital infidelity. And it's you would hope that the variable is extramarital infidelity, always wrong. It's not as predictive for actually having an affair as you would hope it is, right? People sticking to their guns, because people have a belief, but when the rubber hits the road, you hear things like, yeah, but my case is different. So I think maybe sociologically and maybe theologically, there is an alignment that a lot of people do agree on variables, on moral principles. When you say words like tolerance and love and kindness and sharing and generosity, these are all agreeable terms. But what people do is what's going to affect society, not our ideal that at least I don't live up to most of the time. And I think most people probably can say they have room for improvement too, right? So it's a good observation, but what does it mean for society?
Right. All right, let's get back into this. Play the next clip we got lined up here.
How the culture of Europe and its success in America is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a recent
just real quick, he's talking about the argument that maybe Western civilization is indebted to Christianity, an argument I've made a lot. Yeah.
Bible, it seems. I don't really know quite how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian, not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually
he's good too. He's a good
actually
guy.
the great, I wonder what he would have to say on all of this. The Western civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to a religious tradition because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition. A society that today, I'll expand on this if you like, a society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the age of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property, now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. As I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution, which he authored, was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find it funny if it wasn't so offensive to the people who established these very developments against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
Okay, I like Alex a lot. It's hard to know how many errors were just in that because there was just a lot of problems with what I had there. I mean, Galileo was not shown the instruments of torture for doing science. This is utter nonsense. Anything you want to say before I go on a rant here about this section here? Because there was just a lot I really had. There's a lot of problems in this whole section with what Alex was saying here. What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, there's so much. I know he starts with, I think he got cut, but he starts with a question about like other religions. And I guess we'll get more into religious particulars later on. But yeah, generally, if this isn't a question about the truth claims of religions, I don't think it's an issue. And I think later on, Ben doesn't actually like kind of take the bait on that one anyway, but that'll come up later on. The next part was like, okay, so you have this idea that our current value systems come from our religious history. Is that like, what's this kind of new thing that Tom Holland is kind of oddly bringing back? By the way, just let me know if anyone's having trouble seeing or hearing me. I know you're
good.
Frozen. I'm good. Okay. You're frozen for me, but if I'm good, I'll just keep rolling with it.
Yep.
So the idea that our current present, not necessarily like the human rights situation and all of our values, but the idea that our current present is a product of our religious past is an observation that is really as old as sociology. This goes back in the Western canon anyway. This goes back like to Max Weber. His most famous text is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Now, what that means for Protestantism, I guess will vary based on what y'all think about capitalism, and I won't preach politics today, but the idea, right, that like, okay, we're all participating in this economic system and some of us are Protestants, some of us are not, but what we're doing is something that was given to us by our previous value system. I think that method, even if some of the historical details are wrong, is foundational to sociology. It's not like a new resurgent thing with Tom Holland. And not everyone agrees with it in sociology for sure, but it's had a pretty steady string of defenders like throughout the 20th, 21st century. You can still hear, in terms of like you can still hear like arguments from this about this. Like, let me rewind a little bit because Weber did write about like the churches and sects in North America, where he like talked about like their anti-authoritarian nature and their pro-democratic nature too. So like that this gave us our modern world and the things that we like. Hopefully most of us don't like authoritarianism and do like democracy. Mm-hmm. That's an old idea. And does every single sociologist disagree with it? No. Or sorry, agree with it? No. But it has respectable endorsements. People like Robert Putnam, Robert Wuthnow. I don't know. I think you've cited Salem before, right? Like this is something that shows up in the sociological canon a lot. Robert Wuthnow just had a new book on this. He titled it like "Why Religion is Good for American Democracy," I think, and it's a really interesting kind of case-by-case study basis.
The name? Who's the author?
Robert Wuthnow at Princeton, I believe.
Okay.
So, and there's another. What's his name? Putnam. But Robert Putnam has written about this in American Grace and some other works. So, yeah, that was one. Okay, so the next one is, I guess he brings up challenging passages from the Bible, which I think a lot of this, to my earlier point, was going back to the conversations he's been having with theists for a long time, right? We're like predominantly debating, like evangelical Christians who maintain a certain view of scripture. Yeah, like depending on your theology, if he can effectively show that a part of the Bible is immoral, that's a challenge for certain Christians, right? Based on their theology. And that's a conversation that I'm not equipped to solve. But in terms of what has religion actually done, I go back to like the institutions. And I think, yeah, in some cases it was bad, right? Like there were sincere Christians on both sides of the Civil War. There were sincere Christians on both sides of women's rights debates and slavery and things like that. That's true. I think, though, if I'm looking at religious anti-slavery efforts, if I'm looking at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the United States, if I'm looking at the activism of MLK and Howard Thurman and James Cone and others, I don't think, well, the Bible says this, so religion isn't doing that, is not generally a way that we think about this. And I think of the work of people like Sandra Barnes and others who talk about religious activism. There's a study by Feng Yang and someone else at that Purdue Center on like religion activating in times of political oppression as a protest catalyst, which I generally see as a helpful thing too. What I would have liked for them to do, and it's really, this is why you break a debate like this up into subtopics, because he brings up so much, right? And like,
right.
What is your, here's my question for Ben and for Alex, both of whom I think did not meet this bar. What is your measurement for balancing things, right? Because I can list bad things Christians have done relative to like race relations, slavery, and things like that. I can raise good things Christians have done. I can raise bad things Muslims have done. I can raise good things Muslims have done. I can raise secular countries, highly secularized countries I would like to retire in, and I can think of highly secularized countries that would be dangerous for me to live, right? Like, right. What is your, if you're trying to answer, but on balance, is it good? How do you evaluate that? And as we agreed on at the beginning, that's an empirical question, which I didn't see it approached as carefully as I would like to have seen. Yeah.
Well, let me put some slides up here, because for Alex to just sort of claim this idea that, religion, like all these good values, human rights, anti-slavery, were sort of made against like religion. And then religion just claimed it's just utter nonsense. That's not what experts say. For example, they note in this book that, Christianity was crucial for developing equal rights. These linguistic tensions and tangles of our rights talks today are products of a 2 millennium long evolution in the West in which Christianity has played a vital role. Tom Holland notes humanism derives ultimately from the claims made in the Bible. He notes that they note in this book as well that M. Christian Green notes that we see women drawing on the resources of Christianity. Okay, so we see this idea. And then he's also making historical issues. So for one thing, here's actually a letter. This was what Galileo's biggest opponent. And what he says in this letter is, look, if it turns out Galileo's right, it just means we've interpreted scripture wrong. They weren't dogmatic about this stuff. They did not say, okay, this is what scripture says. This is our interpretation. We have to be dogmatic about it in light of all science. No, they were very much open to the idea that if the science shows that they're wrong, they will change their views. Here's another interesting study. He talks about how Christianity is somehow against, causes prejudice against LGBTQ. This study that was done in Brazil shows that no, it's actually mediated by other effects like traditionalism, right-wing authoritarianism. They note that religiosity, actually, when you factor in traditionalism, right-wing authoritarianism, religiosity is actually positively associated with, or negatively associated with LGBTQ prejudice. So religiosity is actually pushing away from that ultimately in the end. This study is one you sent me, and you pointed out that Christianity, you sent me this study a while ago. They point out that as far as religious affiliation is concerned, and it is negatively correlated with LGBT plus legislation in countries with an Islamic majority, but positively correlated in countries with a Christian majority. So you don't see LGBTQ prejudice coming out of the Christian tradition. He brought up verses like 1 Timothy 2. Well, I mean, there's a lot of debate about how that should be translated. And again, I'm going through these really quick, guys, because Alex just sort of like threw them all out really fast. And so not everyone agrees that 1 Timothy prohibits women from teaching. There's a lot of scholarly debate around that maybe we've misinterpreted that. There's a lot of research that shows that Christianity has been spreading democracy, education, all sorts of wonderful values, healthcare, hygiene habits around the world, for example. Now he brought up Galileo as well. He says, Galileo was shown the instruments of torture. Alex, Tim O'Neill wrote an article directly responding to you on this, and Tim O'Neill's an atheist. He says the whole idea that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture has no foundation in any of the trial documents, and nothing indicates that, as O'Connor claims. There was any kind of displaying the Inquisition's instruments of torture and threatening use of them at any point in Galileo's trial. More importantly, the evidence shows very clearly that Galileo was never in danger of being tortured, and that he and everyone else he knew that this was the case. So basically, there's no evidence that Christians were trying to hinder science and Galileo at all. The story behind Galileo is much more complicated. He wasn't tortured or shown the instruments of torture for trying to practice science. What he did was he started teaching an hypothesis as if it was a fact, or in that day they called it a theory. He got in trouble for that, and he was teaching the Copernican idea. The problem is the Copernican model has never been verified by science. People don't realize this because Copernicus said the planets go around the sun in perfect circles. At the time, the opponents of Galileo said there's nothing we know in physics that could support planets moving in perfect circles. You're wrong, Galileo. The science was actually on the church's side in this day, not Galileo's. The only thing Galileo got right was the sun was the center of the solar system. But Galileo didn't get the physics right. It wasn't until Kepler and Newton came along, they'd have an elliptical model, did they get the idea and realize that, okay, now we can explain this in the sense of physics, how the planets can move around the sun. The moment that happened, the church accepted it. They had no problem. They weren't dogmatically insisting the Earth has to be the center of the solar system. So this is an idea that's been debunked out. And this article came out before this whole debate. So unfortunately, I don't think Alex has seen it yet. Hopefully someone can send it to him and let him know that he needs to stop making this argument that Christianity was anti-science and holding back Galileo, as well as the idea that somehow Christianity has been fighting rights development, the idea of human rights, that it's been the human rights has sort of grown out in spite of religion. That's just false. The evidence doesn't show that. The experts don't talk about that. They know Christianity was crucial for the development of human rights, developing in the West, anti-slavery. You go back to like enlightened thinkers. Many of the enlightened thinkers were pro-slavery because they believed in something called the white man's burden, the idea that it was the Europeans' job to, enlighten and civilize the savage races out there. Who was pushing against that? Christian missionaries and abolitionists who thought they were all descendants of Adam. And that's just what data shows. It wasn't like the enlightened thinkers that were leading the charge in the pro-slavery or the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. It was Christians, a lot of Quakers, for example, who were thoroughly convinced slavery was wrong. So for Alex to sort of pretend that this religion has just sort of claimed human rights, abolitionist ideas, science after these things have happened, it's just nonsense. That's not the history of these things. And there's no, when you look into the studies, you look into the research on this, it doesn't support that conclusion. I was very disappointed with Alex at this point of the debate because that just seemed like a new atheist talking point. And I know he's smarter than this.
Yeah, the history of science stuff, I just plead ignorance on. I don't know that as well. I think one of the things that comes to mind here is like what's the counterfactual, like what happens in the absence of religion in these moments. Because in some of the literature and sociology on racial formation theory, like how the U.S. developed its ideas about race and the racial prejudices that come about, there's this kind of around the transatlantic slave trade and in preceding that as well, there's like these ideas of kind of religion and science kind of converging on new ideas. And so like that seemed to be trying to justify racism post hoc. So like you end up with Christians like with this idea of like non-Adamic humans. I don't know if you heard of that category before, but it's like it's a new theology kind of invented out of whole cloth, right? That seems to have not been substantiated by centuries of theology about like everyone coming from common descendants, or even if it's a metaphor for us all coming from being one human family, right? Like how everyone interprets Genesis. But then like science converges on bad ideas about genetics, right? Of like lesser human stock and that sort of a thing. This is like some of the early seeds of eugenics, right? Like I don't see much evidence that there was a backdrop here against which, like, well, if religion wasn't there, like, secular humanism or something would have done it instead, right? It was like, no, because like developments in science were to pervert science in the same way. And I love science, right? Like, I don't think it's an honest expression of science, but that's where the developments were. I think the LGBT rights issue is probably one of the stronger ones that Alex has. That's one of the most difficult ones, I think, to be honest. Like, and there is like a lot of research that will show like higher rates of prejudice among certain religious populations. That's something we have to account for.
Sure.
And I know people who have been like traumatized through that and experienced bad things. Like, I'm not trying to erase that. And I don't think you are either. But the idea is like, were Christians fast enough? Probably not. In the absence of that of religion, let me
just real quick. I just want to say, were Christians fast enough? That's an argument I see atheists often bring up, and I think people forget the history of what's going on when Christianity sort of takes over Europe. It didn't just have free reins to just do what it want. They had to deal with Norman conquest, Viking invasions for a while. They went through a medieval cold period. Then you had Muslim invasions. Then you had the medieval warm period where we started to see growth in science, started to see growth in a lot of philosophy. Then we see the bubonic plague come in, slows things down again. Then you have the Ottomans encroaching. So it took a while. And also through all this period, you didn't have a lot of people reading. The moment the printing press comes out, you have the Protestant Reformation, people start reading the Bible like crazy. What do we see after that? Missionaries are going around the world building schools and hospitals, and people are growing prosperity. Was everything perfect? No. So when people say, well, why was Christianity too late? I think you got to look at the history a little bit more and cut them slack. When you have like entire empires crouching on your door, you don't have time to really sit down and write a treatise on moral values when you have to get your sword sharpened. Okay.
Yeah. Fair. I would say 20th century though, the study I shared in the Journal of Homosexuality, it talks about like, legislation and how that's correlated with like the percentage of the population that affiliates with one religion. It doesn't necessarily tell us about the attitudes of the people there. So I just want to leave space open, like for somebody who is gay, for example, and has heard like nasty things or has like suffered, due to policy, like in that period, right? Like I totally can understand like warfare. Times of war are almost always associated with a decrease in human rights, just across the board. Even like if you're not being attacked, I mean, you look at the United States, and even in the 21st century, like democratic consolidation seems to have gone down, or occurred with the war on terror, for example. I think that is a valid observation. I just do want to leave space for those who have been like, but sometimes it sucked pretty bad for us, and I just want to leave that space.
For sure. Oh, for sure. And that's why I brought up the research I did. It definitely has sucked for a lot of gay and lesbian people, for sure. I think some of the research does show that's not necessarily coming from Christianity per se. It's coming more from like Islamic religion is one study mentioned, or is right-wing authoritarianism, traditionalism, these kind of other factors. And so I think we need to take that into consideration when we're looking at that.
That's an interesting point. And who's Christianity? I mean, go on.
Yeah. You ready to play the next section?
Yeah, sure.
All right, let me pull this up here. This is a section you want to come on. Ben's intuitionist argument, I believe, is that section.
And so the sort of evolution of interpretation is part of the religious tradition. I mean, that's always been the case in my religion anyway. So I always hesitate to speak on behalf of other people's religions because I don't know them nearly as well as I know my own. So when I talk about sort of the application of reason to tradition in the religious tradition, obviously we have books and books and books of texts discussing and debating these very ideas. And the idea of religious debate has always been central to the idea of Judeo-Christian religion. And when it hasn't been, it's been seen as repressive and has spawned then other Christian movements that then argue with the original movement and end up
Yes.
generating in almost Hegelian fashion some new form of interpretation. The point that I'm making is that outside that framework, it doesn't exist. Meaning that once if the argument is over interpretation of particular biblical verses in a context in which there is a God who puts certain moral precepts beyond human judgment, those arguments you can have without threatening the entire social structure. What is very difficult is to have a social structure at all in the absence of fundamental moral precepts that are presupposed by everyone. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing a sort of revival of this idea that religion is very important to the West is because one of the things that we have seen is that as religion has become less important to the West, we've seen declining birth rates en masse. We've seen rises in suicidal ideation. We've seen, especially over the last 10 years, tremendous individual atomization, certainly an extraordinary amount of less social connection. Right? All of these things are things that, frankly, used to be provided by church and these social institutions that, again, were oriented toward a single purpose. So when...
All right, I think we can stop there. You wanted to comment on this section.
Yeah, which let me see. Which part was that again? So you said something about the individualization, though, or
you said Ben's institutional argument.
Oh, right.
You wanted to
comment. I mean, I've covered that a bit, but yeah, just kind of reiterating the. I think his strongest point is like what that the debate and change is a part of the institution, right? Like that is the nature of religion. I cited Wuthnows' book on religion and American democracy, and that was basically his argument. Is he goes over several key moments in U.S. political history where the religious groups came together, they entered the public sphere, they gave voice to different perspectives, allowed for the deliberative mechanisms that make liberal democracy work, and like that is a part of the system, right? And I think rather than, well, the Bible says this and I don't like it, again, maybe important for theology or philosophy, but like what has religion historically done? It often brings space, not always, but it often brings space for debating these sorts of issues. Yeah, that was the main observation, but I feel like I'm getting repetitive on that point.
No, I think it's an important point. I think one thing I remind people of Christianity is Christianity was, its foundation was a reformation. Jesus comes and he wants to reform the Israelites' beliefs in Second Temple Judea. So Christianity is built on reformations. We should expect reformations to keep happening in the Christian tradition because of that. And if that's the case, when things get too far off in different directions, we have had various reformations throughout our history, sort of like correct the path that we're on to get us back on the main point. This was one of the main ideas behind the Reformation. Let's get rid of indulgences. Let's get rid of this idea the Pope can just get anyone out of purgatory whenever he wants, but he's not doing that for some weird reason. Let's reform a lot of these ideas. And even, like Pope Benedict XVI has noted that, Catholics have come a long way, even in responding to the Reformation, where they have reformed internally while the Reformation was happening outside of the Catholic Church. So this idea that somehow, what Ben is bringing up, I think is a good point, because yes, in Christianity, you do see these reformations that are going to happen. That's part of the Christian tradition. Also, he made up an interesting point I'd like for you to comment on about it, this idea that, like we see with declining religiosity, we see lower birth rates, but I also mentioned atomization. We see more people being isolated, not having social structures. That's because the church really provides that. I go to church twice a week, at least, like a Friday Bible study. Well, actually, I'm doing 2 Bible studies now a week. Plus, oh no, we lost Kenneth there. But let me continue my point while he comes back. We're seeing, I go to 2 Bible studies and church. It seems as though church provided more social cohesion is the word I'm looking for. We tended to basically see the world connect with people through community that centered around church. That's where people tended to meet their spouse. That's where people tended to find their social group with their friends, their denomination or their church they would attend, or their synagogue for Jews, that is. With religiosity declining, we're seeing more atomization, as Ben Shapiro talked about. And it does seem as though that Christianity is partially responsible for social cohesion, giving people purpose and meaning, giving people social groups and connections of the like. While that declines, what are we seeing? People are isolating. People are atomizing, these kinds of things. That's not necessarily a good thing. As we see, that's going to lead to more depression. It's going to lead to lower social skills, these kinds of things. So with that, I mean, what do we expect is going to happen with declining religiosity? Kenneth. Yes, I see. He vanished. Unfortunately, his connection probably dropped out, which happens sometime. But I'm going to keep going along until he gets back. So you don't have to worry about it. I have my notes as well, and he can jump back in whenever he wants, and we'll make sure he gets there. So let me put the video back up here, and we will play the next section. And when Kenneth comes back in, he will comment as he goes along. All right, here we go.
Yeah, what do you think quickly about that? When we're talking about religion, do we need to be more semantically sort of accurate,
rigorous? Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, again, I'm not here to defend every form of religion under the sun. There are various forms of religion, ranging from things that people in Judeo-Christian tradition would consider pagan, to Judeo-Christian monotheism, to the distinctions in Judaism and Christianity, which are substantial, obviously. And so, I do believe that there are right forms of religion, or righter forms of religion than others. If I didn't, then I wouldn't be a particularist in my religious practice or my religious belief. And so I do think that, you're right to sort of boil down the question so that people don't end up defending things or being forced to defend things that they wouldn't defend. I mean, you mentioned before Islam. I'll say more radical forms of Islam, because again, I'm one thing that I tend not to do as a religious believer is simply take people's texts at sort of face value, because the reality is that very few people in religious circles take their text at like I can just pick up a Bible, read it, now I know everything that's going on in the Bible value. That really is not how the practice of religion works. I tend to actually judge faith by faith practice, more so than I do by trying to read somebody else's book and then figure out exactly what they're saying, because I've seen people do that enough to my religious practice to sort of object to it. But yeah, of course, I think that you would have to talk, if you're going to talk about the value of religion, you should be more specific. I will say that the value of religion more generally, if you were going to talk about it in just general terms, meaning belief in supernatural things that can't be explained by a materialist universe, the social cohesion point would be the best case in favor of religion, is that virtually every study ever done has shown that social cohesion relies on a common orientation among people in order to build commonality between people. There are really only a few structures in human history that do that. One is a kinship structure. The problem with kinship and tribal structures is that they pretty quickly devolve into tribal warfare upon other members of different tribes. One of the things that religion has done is an attempt to universalize that beyond the immediate sort of tribal self-interest that we discussed a little bit ago. And again, pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, that provide us friendship structures, marriages, that a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it. And so the sort of breakdown of those structures, you could make the case, I suppose, for the breakdown of those structures, but there's been pretty much no replacement for those structures in secular society, and it's creating some pretty significant strains on societal bonding.
Right.
So this was the next section you wanted to comment on. Welcome back, by the way, Kenneth.
Yes,
we lost you there for a little while.
Sorry about that.
I also want to say people were really worried, as you could see here. People were screaming for you, just so you know. They were terrified that you were gone forever. So welcome back.
Well, I came to my office for the secure connection, so much for that.
Yeah, so much for that. All right, so what Ben was talking about is the idea that religion creates social cohesion, it creates social groups, social connections, which is good for people. And when that is removed, that sort of thing breaks down, and we're kind of seeing that in society. What is your comment? What are your thoughts on that?
So I am a little reluctant to argue for causation between like two bivariate trends. I know we talked about this last time I was on your program. Like, okay, well, like here are places with high rates of like prosperity and low economic insecurity. Also happens to be the most secular places in the world. But when you look at like studies about happiness within said countries, it looks a little bit different. So I wouldn't want to necessarily say that like two trends happening at the same time cause each other or are causally related. I think he talks about like the orienting principle. Well, what's interesting is that we still have some of those, right? So like belief in democracy is still high and shared by most people in society, but interpretations of that maybe not so much. So does that leave room for something as like religion as being a unique one, right? Like a unique unifying principle. Research on that is kind of mixed. I mean, one social Ben later asked, like, can we even measure social cohesion? We can, but it's notoriously difficult. And so I know you were playing this while I was gone. Did they get into the like, does what religion matter? Which religion we're talking about matter, or is that later?
Yeah, that's how they started it. Yeah, that's how they started that, yeah.
So this all comes together then. the work on like generalized trust and like how religion like orients social cohesion, I think it's a little more complicated than Ben's giving credit. It's complicated. There are studies in kind of every which direction, and so like and even like looking at Christianity in general, it kind of depends on the denomination. So like it seems like the mainline Protestant tradition is very, which is a very kind of wealthier tradition, is associated with more cohesion. If you have like certain evangelical or fundamentalist groups, which have a very highly individualized theology that actually may not work toward social cohesion or bridging social cohesion with the rest of society. It works great on the inside. One of the other issues is like, I'm just a little reluctant about like, what does the direction of like generalized trust and these sort of beliefs tell us? So for example, it was Robert Putnam, and I had the citation here, I'll make sure I don't get it wrong. Yeah, so like Putnam and Hackett, for example. Robert Putnam is somebody who has written a lot on how like religion, he's most famous for his book, Bowling Alone, but he's argued that like in the absence of religious institutions, society is going to lose like something really important in facilitating social capital and bringing us together. And generally, I find his argument strong. But like he had a study with Conrad Hackett, another great sociologist at the Pew Research Center, where they found that this wasn't the case with minority religions, that members of minority religions in the US were like actually generally less trusting. I don't want to say that that's because members of minority religions are, that this means those religions are not conducive towards social flourishing, right? Like if you are the member of a discriminated against minority group, you probably aren't going to be as trusting, right? Like if you are where the per capita risk of experiencing a hate crime for Jews in the United States is higher than it is for some racial minority groups. If Jews are feeling paranoid and not very trusting, and same for Muslims who are second there, also more than some ethnic and racial minority groups. If they're not trusting, I'm not necessarily going to say that's because Judaism's bad for society, right? Or it has theology that makes you not trust others. I'm going to say that's because anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or whatever is a deeply unpleasant experience. So I think that rather than kind of generalizing stats, I think Ben is onto something, right? Like I do think religion can serve as a strong facilitator for social trust and for uniting society. I think it does depend on the circumstances. So at this part, I guess I'm going in reverse order, but they talked about like, are we saying religion or are we saying what religion? And I would say yes. This is a layered answer. Sociologists treat religion generally. We treat religion as an institution. Like there's the institution of the family, of education, of law enforcement, of government. And so sometimes like asking a question like, is religion good? Is like asking, is government good? Well, as an institution, I'm not an anarchist. I believe that it's a good thing to have governments, but I also recognize that the government of New Zealand is different than the government of North Korea too, right? Like there are certain governments that can cause discord for sure. And there are certain governments that can secure freedoms and maintain order, and generally none are perfect. Same with the family. I recognize the family exists as an institution that by and large is responsible for bringing people together and then rearing the next generation. And that is something that has served humanity well. I understand that there are family structures that are maybe not healthy. I understand that there are individual families that are very damaging to people, right? But I think as an institution, religion has done some things for community, for values. Doesn't mean you can't have it without it, but it has done things. It has served a function for our long human history. It seems like it's something we go back to a lot. And so in a general sense, I think there's that without failing to recognize what happens below. So this is kind of like, if people could take one thing from me, this is kind of my general thesis, one I've been working on for a couple of years and hope to write a book on in the next year or two, is like this kind of, I think we have multiple avenues before us. So there's, from their debating perspective, there's like kind of two arguments. Well, if we just put God back in the public sphere, we're going to be okay. Or if we could just secularize, we would modernize and have progress and we're going to be okay. We've seen both. And I would just say it depends, right? Like I know you had Andrew Whitehead on your program recently to talk about like Christian nationalism. And if that were the future, that would not be a good Christian future outcome, right? And he's another great sociologist.
Yeah, I personally don't think Christian nationalism is ever going to get anywhere off the ground because they're encouraging people to go to church. And when you go to church, you actually lean away from Christian nationalism. So I think it has a self-defeating mechanism in it.
Well, I think that... or it demotivates the project, and there's like work on different countries, right? So I have something under review, an invited piece, and I looked at Italy, Hungary, and the Netherlands. And in Italy, there were looking at who's voting for like these kind of new far right parties, And I could not find major differences between the religious groups in Italy and who was supporting the Lega Nord at that time. It's a different party now, but at that time, who was supporting the Lega Nord? They're kind of right-wing populist party. I looked at Hungary, and it seemed like the Christian Nationalist Project had been somewhat motivating. It was, at this point, the most religious people were supporting the far-right party. But then I looked at the Netherlands, and it was the least religious people who were supporting the far-right party, who I guess are in the process of forming a government right now. They've absolutely skyrocketed since then. So I've seen within that typology, and I'm expanding this to other countries, it's like, okay, there's like the Christian pluralistic multiculturalism, love thy neighbor, and who is thy neighbor? Your neighbor is the ethno-religious other who you think you're better than, but you're not. There's Christian nationalism, and then this is kind of a crude typology, and it's more complicated than this, but broadly, you can have the nationalistic version for Christianity. You have like the pluralistic option, which I more identify with. You have, but for secularism too, you have like, yes, secular pluralism that promotes religious indifference and everyone has the same rights regardless of your religion. And we want to get away from like religious nationalism. That's a good thing to promote. But then there's also what Rogers Brubaker and Kuru and others have called assertive secularism, where it's like, well, like in some cases, secularists can fear for their demographic status too, and they can weaponize the state against vulnerable minorities as well. And so did they get into the, like, would you rather your kid be Muslim or atheist or whatever? Like, just
no,
these sort
they've
of
not
questions.
gotten to that yet. No.
Okay, so then I'll pick up on that later on. But I think like, yeah, I think there is wisdom in asking, does religion have something inherent to it? But I think there's also wisdom in disaggregating the category.
Right. All right. Let's keep going.
Good question.
I have two things to
I'm
say.
going to ask you. Yeah, I want you to say both of those things, but I want to ask you, Alex, can secular societies potentially achieve the same level of social cohesion as religious ones?
Potentially, maybe. I don't know. That seems to be an empirical question, insofar as we can have.
It's kind of weird he's now interested in it being an empirical question, given earlier he was saying all sorts of things about religion being opposed to women's rights and human rights. And that should be an empirical question there. Like, why is it that matter here, but not earlier when he was gish galloping through those things?
Have empirical data on social cohesion as a subject. I wanted to, I suppose, in response to that question, mention the history of the United States as a constitutionally secular nation. Presumably the discussion there devolves into whether America can be described as a Christian nation or not. But based on what you just said a moment ago, before we maybe get into that, you said, of course, we need more specificity is hardly ever worse than less, and that you're not trying to defend all religious traditions. And then you say, but look, this idea of there being a God and there being an unalterable authority and a moral author of the universe is itself valuable, and without it, there are all kinds of societal discohesion comes about. In that case, for example, I wonder, and I hope it's not a crude question, and it's one sort of stemming from genuine interest. Would you rather your child comes to you and says, you know, I think I'm going to convert to Islam, or said, I don't think I believe in God anymore?
As a Jew, I'm fairly indifferent on the question, meaning that my priority is for my child to remain a Jew, and which direction they go from there is of much less interest to me than staying inside the religious tradition that I believe is correct.
Okay, maybe I should rephrase to say, suppose that, you know, half of the US population immediately right now, and half of let's say half of the Christian population, so it's not to do with
Right.
Judaism, and it's not to do with your own family. Half of the Christian population in the United States are immediately going to convert today to atheism if you press this button, or to Islam if you press this button. Which one would you press?
So I'm going to ask for more specificity
Sure.
in line with the conversation. So which form of Islam are we talking about, and which form of atheism are we talking about? Because they come in various strains. But meaning, like, if we're just starting from the premise of no God or Islamic God, that actually is not enough information. Because as I say, I'm not judging people
Yes.
based on their faith propositions nearly as much as I am based on their behavior, which I think they base on faith propositions.
Well, let's
So
say this is the only thing that changes. You press this button, half the Christian population become convinced that there is no real God of the universe. Everything else is random. Whatever you might, because what we're discussing here is essentially what are the implications of such a worldview?
Right.
What are the implications of atheism, which is just the disbelief in God, or the belief that
do
there is
people have
not one.
memories? Sorry, in this hypothetical, do people have memories, or they don't have memories? Because this makes a difference.
They have memories.
Okay, fine. So then probably in the West, atheism, as opposed to a more radical form of Islam. That's why I was asking for specificity.
Well,
because they're more
the button
moderate
on the
forms.
right-hand side was going to be that they just become convinced that Muhammad is the final prophet of God.
Right.
That's it.
And again, I was going to ask for more specificity on that, because I know many moderate Muslims who are not radical in the implication of their faith, as opposed to some who very much are quite radical in the implications of their faith. So, but let's, if you don't mind, I'm going to set up your hypothetical in a way that I think is more clarifying for me anyway. And that is button on the right is radical Islam, like Taliban style Islam.
Okay.
And button on the left is don't believe in God.
Well, I mean, you can do that.
The reason I'm doing that is because that elucidates a difference that I think is being obscured by the simple sort of belief in God, not belief in God question, meaning that the cultural heritage of that's why I asked if people have memories or people don't have memories. If people have memories, then that looks very much like secular Europe right now, which does have
the cultural heritage
in the bloodstream a lot of Judeo-Christian values in a way.
Okay, I think we can stop there. Okay, so basically, I think I get what Ben is getting at here, and I agree with him fully. If I had that buttons in front of me, I said the same thing I said on Matt Fradd's channel. I would totally go with the secular one, because part of me is convinced secularism is completely unsustainable, not just because of birth rates, but because of polarization, atomization, these kinds of things that come out of it, and it ends up it takes too much away from the traditional Christian society. People takes things out that people actually need, like approaching the sacred, religious aspects in other ways, that people end up going back to that stuff in a generation or two later. So that's why I would take that. Whereas Islam is a lot more long-term structural kind of system that could last longer. So, but what are your thoughts on this whole section here?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't like the question. I thought it was a weird setup.
I don't. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you? And I guess again, to the question, like, what does this tell us about what religion does for society? You have, okay, would you rather either your kids or society going to go half Muslim or half atheist? I just could not get an answer to that question with no other information. And then I guess Ben's rejoinder is like, well, I'd rather live in a secular society than specifically, he mentions like a radical Islamic society. Okay, but that's, you qualified one but not the other. That's not very elucidating either. I think everybody would rather live in a generally secular society than a radical Islamic society. Just like I could say, well, I would rather live in a moderate or liberal Muslim country. What was that?
Oh no, I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would rather live in a country with like the ideology of, Kazakhstan, the 1930s Soviet Union or something, right? Like I don't think, or later or whatever, like under Stalin, I don't think either one of those tells us a great grand principle about what religion does for us, right? That like but they take the idea though, what's interesting is like, they kind of take the idea that, well, is there the memory as kind of a byword thing? But I would say that, which they didn't settle on, is actually the better sociological question. What is the memory and does the memory matter? That's the good sociological question, but they focused, I think, on the wrong part there.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you there. I think it is. And again, this doesn't really tell us whether or not religion is good for society. Right. I can agree Islam is not as good as Christianity as some studies have found. But that doesn't tell us whether other religions like Christianity or Judaism is good or not. I mean, I could agree. I think Scientology is extremely bad in multiple ways. But again, what are we talking about with whether or not religion is good? This is why I won't really do debates on is religion good for society. I want to just do is Christianity good or not, because I'm not going to defend Scientology or Islam or these kinds of things. Thank you for the super chat. IP deserves every dollar he receives, and I pray he gets the funds to go full time so he can continue being one of our top apologists. Much appreciated. I am going full time right now. We're just trying to raise funds so I can actually hire some people to help me, because things are getting bogged down with that. Alhamdulillah from Buff IP. Much appreciated, Buff IP. Did God use deception in 2 Kings 7:6? Really quickly, this is about when the Syrians flee. It says, so there arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians, but when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there, for the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and of horses, the sound of a great army. And so they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired us, the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians, to come against us. Well, I mean, that's not direct deception. That's just a ruse. I mean, that's used in war often. That's just a typical war tactic. And they interpreted it how they want. So God didn't force them to interpret it a certain way. I would not say it's like direct lying or being dishonest in that way. Just having some certain noises go out and then people interpret it as something else and they flee is a pretty good tactic people often use in war. And no one would consider that to be immoral, even if you would consider it deception, especially on a virtue ethical stand. Kenneth has a cool person vibes. Thanks for coming on. And you
Thank you.
upset somebody here, Kenneth, though. The glorious leader of New Zealand says, I take issue with your previous statement.
Well, I was trying to find an example. New Zealand scores high on some metrics that I use in research, but I'm not the glorious leader, and I'll defer to the glorious leader. Oh, this is merging the two cases. That's really neat. They must have gone and made a new account just for that. I respect it.
It sure did. They probably did. All right, here's the next section you want to talk about. So let's key this up here.
Seriously, and do need to be taken essentially at face value. That is some of the very specific legalistic commandments of the Old Testament, for example, or of the Hebrew Bible, I should say. These are not, when people list these and say that these are potentially morally problematic and may have done something towards hindering, for example, like I mentioned earlier, the abolition of slavery in the United States. Of course, there was a great deal of religious influence on both sides, which is something that I've already mentioned. But don't you think that this problem could have been solved a lot more easily if there had been a stronger religious tradition of opposition to the ownership of other human beings? Why can't that have been the case?
Okay,
because Scripture quite explicitly condones it,
right,
and in fact gives you the details of how to do
Yes,
it.
so-
that's something that couldn't have been done, in other words,
This
because
is fun
you've
for me.
taken
Now I
this,
get to do Talmudic law. So
this
here's
moral
here's
principle
the,
that's placed outside of meaningful debate.
Okay, so on this section, there's a lot to say here for sure. What did you want to comment on this? And then I want to talk about the whole historical slavery aspect and the theological aspect that he's bringing up.
Okay. Again, I think this is them kind of, and Ben will kind of fall into it too later in this exchange. But I think they're falling into the old kind of like theology, philosophy, apologetics debate. Like,
for sure.
Is this worthy of God? Again, that's a great question. I stuff I read about, for fun, and I think I've got great theologians upstairs at this university and all that. But religion. What did religion ultimately end up doing with in the world of like social inequality and things like that? I mean, that can coexist along like a text that needs to be negotiated. And I think it bears asking, like, again, like, whose religion here, right? Where it's like, okay, like some edgy trad guy might say something stupid about slavery and want to endorse it today, but I wouldn't take that as definitive of a religion. I mean, I think most religious institutions that I'm aware of see slavery as morally wrong. And you can, I guess, Alex can argue that is it consistent with their holy texts and things like that. But that is what they're doing, right? That is what, and that's what they've done a lot in history. Not all the time. He made that point, and I acknowledged that point earlier. I think Ben later on kind of stays off the theological criticisms, and I just don't know if that's the most efficient way for him to make the counter argument either. It seems to kind of collapse into these theological debates, but I think the general institutional argument that like religion is an option for preserving social equality doesn't do it perfectly all the time, but the idea that like religion can help us in these hard times, you don't need to fall on that theological side of a debate to believe that. I guess Alex it seemed like in a lot of points here, Alex was kind of expecting to debate like a conservative evangelical who didn't believe in the New Testament, right? Like, and it was like, if I can get you, because he's going to start asking about contradictions later on. He's going to start asking him, like, was that a moral command or was that not a moral command? Again, like, not to disrespect the theologically and philosophically inclined viewers, because I think those are great questions, but for another discussion. God doesn't have to be portrayed as perfect in the Old Testament for religion to be doing good things for democracy here, or to be key in abolitionism or in the civil rights movement in the U.S., Azusa Street, et cetera, right? Like, those are parallel conversations.
Yeah, and the other important aspect here is I think this is often missed a lot of time on atheists or skeptics of the Bible, is that we have to remember that everyone in the ancient world was pro-slavery. Many Christians were pro-slavery. No one denies that. All of a sudden, in the Christian tradition, there is a growing movement that comes out, and they start saying that slavery is wrong because this is what the Bible teaches. Okay, again, everyone was pro-slavery. That was just human culture. What led to the abolitionist movement? Well, it was this movement within Christianity. If you want to point to the pro-slavery Christians, you go, yeah, but you have those guys over there. Yes, but again, they're just doing what literally every human thought was normal. And all of a sudden, from a historical standpoint, Christianity produces this movement where there's now people that are abolitionists and they want to end slavery, and that now becomes the standard moral norm in the West. So you very well can give Christianity a lot of credit for the reason most people today think slavery is bad. Because if you go back 400, 500 years, everyone thought it was the norm, especially people outside of the West. That's changed because of Christianity. So I don't think they don't give enough credit to this factor that actually caused that. This is, again, going back to the Holland thesis, as well as other scholars like Robert Fogel have made this point as well. So, I mean, there's that idea there. The whole theological idea that he brings up. Okay, go ahead. What is it?
No, yeah, I would just like, as an institution, like, I'm curious, like, what is it about Christianity that in the first few centuries, like, motivates people to start like buying slaves so they can manumit them, right? Like, you start to see this happen pretty early. And it seems that like there's institutional force behind this. And I've also like kind of been interested in like the anti-militarism of the early church as well. And it's not to say that it doesn't fall into bad patterns later on, right? But like this, it's kind of interesting that Christianity kind of takes this kind of direction, right? Like this happens pretty early. And then there are some dark periods in between in parts of the world, or parts of the U.S. particularly, not only, but parts of the U.S. And then it kind of comes back to that, right? Like there seems to be something about the institution that bends toward justice, right? Like I've really enjoyed MLK as well. His recent biography written by Jonathan Ike really unpacks the theology here and the rich tradition that he's able to tap into, right? Like that's a part of religion that not to sweep other stuff under the rug, but I don't think there's a part where you say, but that doesn't count as your religion because I found something in the Bible or something, right? Like I know there's a theological interpretive argument to be had there that I'm not equipped to, but even if it were to hypothetically succeed, I just wouldn't be dissuaded from like what I see and what I'm impressed by in those kind of movements.
And the other point is like, if you're looking at this from a theological perspective, like you're mad at God for certain verses in the Bible, even though the Bible itself was led to the abolition of slavery and the changing of moral values to be anti-slavery. Like at the end of the day, we could talk about the Old Testament passages, but there's no reason to think those verses led to more slavery, given that Christianity is the reason people are anti-slavery today. Like it's hard. It doesn't make a lot of sense. What's that?
Ben makes like a similar argument. I think later.
Like, why are you getting mad at why are you getting mad at the book that led to the end of slavery and changed all of our moral values on this? Because of certain verses that don't apply, that the Christians never think actually apply to them, or that even a lot of Jews today don't even think apply to them. Like it's a very weird argument. Like you got to be very careful not to read too much into the Mosaic Law as if that's prescriptive for all people in all times. So even modern Jews don't even take it that far, especially in more like the Reformed or conservative movements. And Christians most certainly don't think that. So it's a weird argument to make. And again, what actually led to the end of slavery? Well, biblical values did it at the end of the day. And we see this early in Christianity. The first guy to ever say that slavery should be abolished was Gregory of Nyssa. Okay, so we're not talking about like secular people, pagans of the time, this kind of thing. No, it was Christians pushing for this radical idea early on. So, all right, let me put the video back up and we will get back into the next section you want to play here. I think this is one of Ben's rejoinders. Let's take a look.
Germany. So, these evils continue to exist in the human heart.
Even if this was a liberalizing force, and even if this was not as bad as other slavery, do you think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes.
So how do you account for God commanding something which you now see to be, or rather permitting something and explicitly and giving you details about how to do something which is proactively immoral?
Because he's not permitting me, permitting my great to
do something immoral,
to do something
immoral
that in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered immoral,
right.
But was it immoral?
By today's standards that were developed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, sure. By today's standards developed under the Judeo-Christian tradition, immoral. So which, by the way, you're living off that. You're again, not to get back to the Tom Holland argument. You're living off the remains of this. I mean, where's your morality coming from?
But who's the moral relativist now? I mean, it seems that a moment ago you say that the great success of religion is providing a sort of untouchable moral basis that sort of transcends human affairs and human debates. And now when I say, well, look at this, open your own religious scripture and look at this blatant immorality, you say, yeah, but well, that was considered to be fine at the time. It's considered to be bad now by the progress of Judeo-Christian
there's a question
values. Who's the moral relativist here?
Well, it's not relativistic to say that that a thing that is wrong today is considered wrong today because of a tradition that developed over time.
The question I'm asking is not, was it considered right or wrong at the time of biblical slavery?
It was wrong.
Was it wrong?
It was wrong then to hold a slave. Yes, it was wrong then to hold a slave, obviously. And also, if you are God and you are pragmatically attempting to woo people away from slavery, was it a practicable thing to simply, quote unquote, abolish slavery? Or
here's an idea for.
So yeah, that's the argument that's often I've made in the past. It's this idea that God is working with people in a fallen world, a really bad culture, permitting certain things to get them further along, even though he doesn't endorse it. We see this in Matthew 19 with the law of divorce. Jesus said that law was given because your hearts were hard. And so this is another theological question. And this is not moral relativism necessarily, because you can have a virtue ethical outlook and believe that circumstances apply and they determine whether or not something is objectively morally good or objectively morally bad. Like, for example, Trent Horn was using this example recently. He used the example of the modern day factory farms. We consider them to be bad for animals, not necessarily ideal at all. But do we just abolish that? Well, no, because we have growing populations. This is the most technology we have to be able to feed the growing billions of people on the planet. We need to keep using that despite it not being ideal. You go back to the ancient world, things are definitely not going to be ideal. You don't have ancient prison systems. You have to have certain ways of punishing people necessarily that are going to have to be based in the culture. Are they going to be ideal? Absolutely not. Are we going to say that that means slavery is a good thing? Absolutely not. But from anyone's outside perspective, you got to see that cultural factors do play in the role of deciding what is going to be the most objective or most virtuous path to take.
Yeah, I mean, we ask, I almost got cut in, right? Like I got cut in. I was thinking of the debate, like what is the Bible and what are these texts? But ultimately, like I think, this is kind of repetitive of what I was saying earlier, but I forgot where I was actually. Anyway, yeah, I think that I don't think that if biblical deontology fails, religion is bad for society, or something like that. It's still this doesn't show religion is bad just because there's certain things in the Bible. I brought this up in my debate with Aaron Raw. You can find bad verses in the Bible. Typically, they're descriptive. But that does not mean that transitions into harmful effects in society today, especially if the majority of Christians do not think that Leviticus applies for them now. You got to actually show evidence that these verses lead to harmful outcomes. You just can't point to verses in the Bible and say those are bad, therefore they cause harmful effects in society. That's just not how it works. You got to actually show evidence. It's one thing that's been really curious to me, and I would love to, the comparative historical guy in me would love to revisit it, but I was like reading about, I think it was the Sanhedrin, right? Like the older Jewish court. And so like you have just kind of a plain English reading of the text, you have like a lot of capital punishment in the Old Testament, right? And then if I'm not mistaken, the Jewish court, some of the earliest records we have is they consolidated around a view that like if the court killed more than like 7 or 8 people in a decade or something, that the court was like considered murderous. That's really interesting, right? Like I think that is not the theonomist read today of like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Exodus, right? But like there was something like even pre-Christian in Judaism as a religion that despite what, the kind of basic instructions before leaving Earth view of Leviticus says, that led actually like away from, only killing 7 or 8 a year. I mean, for ancient like capital punishment standards, that's quite low, right? Like they were like kind of looking for escape hatches from that. Like there is something in the religion that seemed to move Jewish people away from that, right? Like, and I don't think that is rebutted by, it says, death penalty here in Leviticus 29, whatever, or however, right? Like there is something interesting about the religion that moves in a reformist direction that I find impressive by ancient standards.
Well, yeah, you just can't look at certain verses in the Bible or the Quran even and go, look, I don't like this. This causes harmful effects in society.
Mhm.
You need actual evidence of it to make that. And this is I see a lot of atheists online doing this with the Bible. Look at what God allows here. This is bad. This is going to lead to people killing other people or impressing other people. And my response always is, where's your evidence of that? Why do we see Christianity correlating with the opposites, like lower aggression, more self-control, more freedom and equality? Why do we see this playing out? This is just armchair sociology. You just can't look at verses, say those are bad. Those verses are going to cause people to do bad things. That's not how sociology works. But that seems to be what Alex and I see a lot of other atheists online doing.
Yeah, I mean, I see Ben kind of arguing in kind here, to be fair. At this part of the debate, I like his institutional approach here, but I think he kind of falls into it a little bit here with like, well, this is what God had to do. Well, that's a different question than like, what does religion do to society? At least I think so.
Yeah, and I understand that argument because again, when you're dealing with an imperfect people in an imperfect world with limited resources, unless you're going to remove their free will, you have to work with where they are to bring them further along. Like we do this today with like Saudi Arabia. We say, hey, give women the right to drive. That doesn't mean they have full equality yet, but it's a step in the right direction. If we went in and tried to force our will upon them, they're gonna revolt. There's going to be major wars, going to be more bloodshed. This is a much better way. This ease incremental steps. And psychologists do show that incremental steps are a better way to get people to a better place instead of expecting them to just dramatically change overnight. So I think we need to apply psychology to the people in the ancient Near East, the ancient Israelites. Why don't we do that? Why is it always, why didn't God just force them to be perfect right away? It's a weird argument when we don't even expect that in psychology today. Yeah. All right. This is the last section you have queued up. So let me play this part.
Which is to say,
that'd be shocking.
Yeah, I think everything that I've heard you say, Ben, on this subject, and everything that I think you may be about to say, not everything, but some of it, involves saying that, look, what we need to do is encourage strengthening family and having children and not doing drugs and all of this kind of stuff, which people, like you say, have traditionally, this has been somewhat the prerogative of the church to maintain. I think that people just don't believe in God anymore. And so what I would say is just to encourage those things without the God. The question I would leave, and I'm sorry, I've just promised no debate, but here's something. Look, suppose it's the case that I agree wholesale with your proposition that religion is good and maybe even necessary for society in some way, right? Suppose I just say that that's true. I don't believe it's true. I've tried, I'm sorry, I just don't believe it. And so I'm now left with a choice here. I don't think it's true, but I become convinced that it's somehow useful or beneficial. What am I to do with this information? You can't just choose to believe in God. People say you can choose to act as though you believe in God. That's kind of true until something really testing comes along. If you don't really believe it in your heart, you will falter at the first opportunity. How am I to raise my children? Am I to lie to them? Am I to say, well, I don't believe in any of this nonsense, but because I think it, promotes a sort of non-replacement, birth rate, then I'm just going to bring them up believing things that I think are false. I don't think this can happen. It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question, that outgo the idea of being, truthful and being honest and talking about things that you think are philosophically sound. Now it's essentially faith-based, and it's about trying to make as many people, the greatest good for the greatest number across society and societal cohesion, even if you think it's false. In other words, I'm someone who is an atheist. I don't believe it's true. If I just grant everything you've said about the utility that religion provides, what am I to do?
So I think that's an interesting question Alex proposes, and my honest response is I don't know what he's supposed to do as an atheist. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if he grants everything, then that's the debate, right? Like this is kind of my frustration with the back and forth, that like this is going back to the truth claims of religion, which we already have so much of those kind of debates. That's what like this whole world is kind of the discourse that Alex is involved with is dominated by. Again, it's interesting. I'm not saying it's bad, but I think to ask a sociological question and for them both to bring it back to, but is religion true? It's just not the question right now. I guess, so what if he, so I guess to answer the question literally, what if I grant all of that, then I guess you don't tell people religion's bad for society. I don't know if Alex has ever said that explicitly, but yeah, that was one of the things I was saying earlier, is that you look at the literature, and those who point out like where religion has helped society, where religion has contributed to social capital or anti-authoritarian movements or resettling refugees, something I work on. This is not determined by a religious commitment to make these observations. So I guess there shouldn't be a problem. I wouldn't tell Alex, if you come to agree that religion can be helpful, that you should lie to your kids about what you believe. I just don't even see the avenue to that. I mean, I think there are positive benefits with religions I don't subscribe to, and I don't feel the need to convert to them at all. I think there are. I mean, I don't live that way. I mean, there are virtues and things that I'm not a part of that I still don't join.
Yeah, I mean, if I was an atheist, and let's say Christianity didn't exist, and I was convinced Islam was good for society, I wouldn't raise my kids Muslim, to be honest. I mean, I don't think anyone is expecting Alex to take that position, that he has to sort of raise his kids Christian because Christianity is good for society. Because I wouldn't do that in that hypothetical I mentioned. But I don't think I'd be attacking it because I would know it would be good. I would just sort of stay out of it, hope it maybe grows if it was good. This is my problem with a lot of online atheists, is they're just so vindictive and hateful, and they have an axe to grind against Christianity. Why? It's really good for society, ladies and gentlemen. Why spend hours making videos trying to convert people when it doesn't matter ultimately? You just think everyone's going to die and rot in the grave, and this gives people a lot of purpose and meaning and hope. Why would you want less of that when it is associated with so many benefits? I'm not saying you have to raise your kids Christian, but don't lie to your kids and tell them that the religion is harmful. That's just not how it works. Actually, tell them the truth. So I think this is just evident or similar to what I see a lot of atheists doing. They just assume that it's somehow harmful or bad and need to work against it, make more people atheists. Again, if I was an atheist, I'd never try to deconvert anyone. I wouldn't probably even talk about this kind of stuff.
Has Alex historically called Christian religion harmful or anything? Because my understanding was his story was he studied theology, he found it valuable, he found it important. I think he said something about he lived with Christians for a while to he kind of because he talked about non-resistant non-belief, right? And there was a part of him that I guess was open to it or wanting it to be true. So I gather there may have been some background to this debate where they had back and forth videos or something that may have contextualized it to a certain degree. I didn't understand. I
don't know if he's directly said it's harmful. I don't know if he's directly said religion is harmful, but he is taking the negative position in this debate. So it seems like he is. And he did have that segment earlier where we talked about Christianity hindering science, rights sort of growing against the religious tradition, which is just completely false. So, I mean, I think he kind of does think it could be harmful, I guess, or it's potentially harmful, or it does have some harmful aspects again. But I mean, it's an empirical question. They never really get to that, though, unfortunately, in this debate. The actual empirical evidence does not support this idea. It's a very weird argument to even try to make. So again, if I was an atheist, the last thing I would want to do is reduce the number of Christians in society. I don't understand why there are so many atheists online that have made that their life goal. They do not realize the seeds of destruction they're sowing in society, in my view.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just still thinking about Alex, but okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just a thing. Again, I don't think anyone's expecting atheists to raise their kids Christian just because it's good, but at least acknowledge that it is. That's all we're asking from atheists. Just stop pretending it's harmful and you're doing the world a favor by deconverting everyone. So that's what I would have said in that debate with him. I wouldn't expect him to raise his kids contrary to what he believes or anything like that. With that, what are your overall thoughts of the debate, how it went? I was thoroughly disappointed in it because, again, they didn't really get to the empirical question, which we've reiterated multiple times here. They've just sort of beat around the bush, talked about it theologically, but not sociologically.
Yeah, I guess, I'll start with the main things I liked. The main thing I thought that Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor both had kind of one main thing that I think was good. And I think for Ben Shapiro, it was going back to the institutional arguments of how do religions actually function in the real world. I think Alex initially trying to unground from the like, is this true? But it doesn't matter. What matters is how people actually live. Like, I thought those were both valid points to make that we can maybe stick with and kind of advance the field along. But yeah, I think it continued to collapse into like kind of traditional philosophical, theological, apologetics debates about like the existence of God, the truth claims of the Bible and things like that, which isn't really what most sociologists are concerned with when we study this. I thought it was more collapsing into that than a sociological debate. I mean, I take a stance that I would call like moderately pro-religious. I think that religion like serves some functions, some positive functions in society. I think that it can go awry, and I kind of feel the same way about secularization, that secularization can do some good things for us and it can go awry. I don't see like religion in the public sphere or secularization as like a doomsday scenario. I don't see either one as just that. Back to the question, would you rather everyone be Christian or Muslim or atheist tomorrow? I need more information, man. Like what are the avenues that we're paving forward? And I guess when I try to stake my position, which I guess not that other people have to adapt to that, but it was actually kind of hard to interpret some of this like along what I think would be a relevant sociological debate. I came into this thinking that it would be a bit more lopsided, actually. Because I know that Alex is a very good debater, and I would say, like, aside from like theology stuff, when it comes to like social commentary and politics, I probably align with Alex a lot more than I do with Ben. And so like I was expecting something very different than what I saw too. I don't know. I'd like,
yeah,
maybe one of them, maybe there could be a do-over with different partners. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'd like to debate Alex on this and talk to him more about it and make it more sociological. I know someone was trying to set that up. It just hasn't happened yet. Okay. What are your thoughts on the idea of like declining religiosity, specifically declining Christian religiosity? Do you think, because we've seen meta-analytical research show that religiosity is positively associated with lower depression and better mental health, do you think that has the potential to lead to more depression, lower mental health? Because we are seeing a spike in society of like more people are reporting being depressed. Do you think there's an association there? I know no studies have looked at this, but do you think there could be some sort of association there with, as religiosity declines, since religiosity has been shown in meta-analysis to correlate with lower depression, we're going to see a spike in depression or similar ideas? So
there was a study published recently, and I don't remember who the lead author was, but they showed that like periods of doubt and disaffiliation could be associated with like increased depressive symptoms and things like that. So that would be like the easiest mechanism I see leading to that. On the other hand, look, I know that there are other cases of society that have secularized and that has not by and large happened too. So I don't think it's like a demographic destiny argument or anything. I think of it this way, that yeah, religion is associated with mental health benefits. I think that's clear, and that shows up in psychological practice and social psychological research. It doesn't mean, though, that like if someone's not religious, they can't take up jogging, they can't take up long form reading, they can't go to therapy and do things that like are shown to help with mental health, right? It just means that religiosity is one of many things that appears to be like good for the human mind. So I would be a little reluctant to say, like, I know for certain that secularization, and I know some people have predicted this, that it's going to result in further atomization and individualization and the loss of community, which would be very bad for us. I know that argument's out there. The only theory I've ever really married in sociology, though, is like what's called multiple modernities. And I think it's going to be different in different parts of the world, probably. Like, I think there are going to be places that handle demographic changes either toward religion or away from it differently. And I guess I would need more information. I would worry in some contexts and not all. About that particular issue.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I totally agree there are other factors. I just wonder more on large scale things. I think a lot of people that are minimum wage or more in the lower classes tend to draw to religion for more purpose and meaning, whereas people in like higher class status, like people that work in academia, people that are working in the media or politicians, can draw on that actual occupation to give them purpose and meaning, whereas your gas station employee, your grocery store clerk doesn't really find a lot of meaning in those. Do they find meaning in religiosity? So I think a lot of times the elites tend to miss that religion has that for the lower classes, and so they push away from religiosity because they have purpose in their occupation, but they forget that the average person doesn't have that same opportunity. And so that's why I think that, people tend to replace that on the lower ends of society with hedonism, video games, pornography, these kinds of things to give them some sort of fulfillment that religion has been when religion is removed from them in that regard. And so I think there's an interesting connection there in terms of how religion sort of helps the majority of people, even though that people in the higher status positions don't necessarily need it for purpose or meaning.
Yeah. So then the other question that naturally follows is, would religion decline for those people? Because I think one of the more reliable theories of secularization has been existential security. And it seems like people do retain religiosity when they are in those sorts of conditions, right? Where you look at the United States and religious people, disproportionately ethnic racial minority, the more it depends. The NONES nuns are a peculiar category, but it seems like some of the most secularized categories are relatively higher income, relatively more white than the general population, and that seems to more or less replicate globally. So, the bigger question is like, would they even secularize to begin with? And I think if for some reason, like a poor, marginalized ethnic minority worker somewhere in the U.S., I think a lot about fellow Mexican Americans who are mostly Catholic, Pentecostal, Baptist, and stuff like that. If you were to just suddenly take that away from us, I think that would be bad. Like, especially if that would happen like overnight. Now, people's individual secularization journeys, that's kind of tailored. But if for some, if somebody, I mean, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the dumbest idea in the world, trying to ban Catholicism in Mexico. But if somebody tried that again and pulled it off, I would worry about my people. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. All right. Thank you for the super chat. You should do some videos on Thomism, the 5 ways, maybe, but the Catholic apologists have sort of hit that one. I mean, it's like, we don't need another video on the Kalam. I want to get to videos that people haven't done, topics people haven't done. So like, not a lot of people have done videos on what I'm going to be doing this summer on defending gospel reliability. There's not been a lot of research on that put out. So I'm going to be doing that. So I want to focus on stuff that people haven't gotten to, not just do the same arguments that have already happened. Thoughts on the minimal witness hypothesis. So I don't remember this exactly off the top of my head, but I think this is a naturalistic hypothesis that is in contrary to the resurrection hypothesis. I think it's ad hoc. I think it multiplies assumptions beyond necessity. It also, I think it might be a good response to the minimal facts argument, but not the maximal facts argument for the resurrection, which is something I tend to take. I don't think it really is it competes with the resurrection hypothesis in my view, because it just multiplies too many assumptions beyond necessity and assumes that somehow miracles are going to be the least probable, which I don't really agree with. How do you go about studying so many books, note-taking, book tags, superhuman memory? Memory is good. I read with a highlighter so that when I go back through the book, I can remember things that I want to remember. And, making video scripts helps me remember as well, obviously. I have that advantage there, but I tend to read with a highlighter. I do take notes. I'll make outlines of things that helps with that. Do you have any advice on this, Kenneth? I'm
kind of the same way. Highlight, take notes, then revisit. And if I have the opportunity to write through them, if it goes into a literature review and I've discussed it myself, that helps me to remember things a lot. But that's really particular to my job. Yeah.
Is any of Ravi Zacharias still good to use for Christians who are reaching out to non-Christians? Book talks, arguments. That's a sticky subject. I would say don't quote him. Don't use his stuff. Honestly, if you thought he made a good argument, just put the argument into your own words and use it. But don't have to cite him. Please don't cite him. He has tainted his reputation forever, and that needs to be acknowledged. I think Mike Winger said it best when he did his live stream on him a couple years ago. All right, I have a special treat for you, Kenneth. Are you ready for this?
Okay.
You ready?
Yeah.
I don't think you're ready for this.
Uh-oh. Oh.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Is This Christian Nationalism? The show where a bunch of lunatics argue about a concept that has absolutely no functional definition whatsoever. I'm your host, Kip Sweaterbest. Let's meet our contestants. First up is Maisie, a woman who is, 19 or 56, and from the hair, I'm assuming is either a West Virginia bartender or somehow connected to an Ivy League university.
And my pronouns are he, her.
And we're sick of you already. Next up is Jerry Berry, the churchy fruit. Jerry recently traveled the cornball legalist, the smug antinomian pipeline, which means he used to be kind of cute, but now he talks like a Methodist lady pastor attending a Mitt Romney prayer breakfast. Welcome to the show, Jerry.
Thank you, Kip. It's just such an honor to be a part of this pivotal faith conversation.
Yeah, see what I mean? He's gross. All right, next up is an angry, disaffected, father-wounded young man desperately longing for community after being crushed by a world that taught him to despise his race, his sex, and his culture. And I was very close to feeling sorry for him until he chose to play the game under the cover of his anonymous social media avatar, which for some reason is this.
Don't dox me, you gay coward.
Hey, you might be worse than Maisie.
Well, he is a
Well, you remember that earlier you mentioned the anime profile picture
Oh,
for
that's a trad person?
that's the trad person, yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
You might be worse than Maisie.
well, he is a white male.
And now you're tied. Okay, let's play this
Yeah, now they're tied, yes.
stupid game now. Contestants, for the purposes of this show, let's say that Christian nationalism is a social and governmental system in which Christianity is the driving force that shapes a nation's laws, people, and culture. Can we all agree to stick to that definition for the next 3 minutes?
Sure.
Yes.
I don't believe you. Nevertheless,
Do you agree with that definition for Christian nationalism?
I mean, I recently revisited Andrew Whitehead's interview with you, and I liked the one that he offered, where it was like a cultural framework that took like an idealized version of Christianity that's kind of filtered through ethnic and racial homogeneity, and in wanting to like impose that on religious and ethnic others. I'm not sure if there are certain ways that I think like. Because there's the category of Christian nationalism, there's also like civil religion and different types of civil religion, and now like there's kind of this like splitting of like Christian nationalism and Christian statism, and the definition used in the video, I'm not sure where that sits within that conversation. I thought Andrew Whitehead in the last video with you described it well though.
Yeah, this is what I find that a lot of laymen think Christian nationalism is, and so I appreciate the Lutheran satire using it because this is like the way that's fine. It's told so generally, I don't even know what it means, and that's not the Christian nationalism I would ever fight against. But yeah.
nevertheless, I'm going to show you a bunch of things that don't fit that definition at all. Then I'm going to ask you, is this Christian nationalism? All you have to do is say no, and you'll win the game. Let's play. Hey guys, is this Christian nationalism? Maisie.
Yes.
Ooh, incorrect.
But I see prayers and a flag. That's Christian nationalism.
And the definition of Christian nationalism is?
Christians vaguely existing in public.
I hate this job.
That is not Christian nationalism.
Very good, young man. 10 points
That's
for you.
Christian suicide.
And here we go.
Because race mixing is always a precursor to the destruction of Christian empire.
Guys, please, this is just a regular Christian couple praying that God would forgive them for using the power of the state to control other people's lives instead of focusing on their own self-wounds of brokenness.
I hate that answer.
Let's tame those ovaries, dude.
You're worse than scabies.
All right, let's move on to round 2 before I lobotomize
shingles, it's no
myself with a
fun.
pool cue. Contestants, the man on the left.
What's that?
I just had shingles, by the way. That's no fun.
Yeah, no.
The man on the left is a secular liberal voting for a Democrat because their shared metaphysical presuppositions cause them to share political beliefs. That's called democracy. The man on the right is a conservative Christian voting for a Republican because their shared metaphysical presuppositions cause them to share political beliefs. That's called
Christian nationalism. No, he's doing Christian nationalism. We talk about this all the time at my school.
Please don't tell me you made the dean's list, Maisie.
I'm the dean.
I hunger for death. Well, I see our anonymous friend got banned again and has now switched to his alternate account named after an obscure 17th century theologian he's never actually read. So the gentleman on the right.
Direct election of senators is a Jewish conspiracy.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
Why are you a salamander now?
It's popular with the higher status man boys of my tribe, and I covet their validation.
Yeah, well, I covet the life of Job. Jerry Bear.
It's not Christian nationalism. Because it's not Christian, God gave us the separation of church and state for a reason. And the second we Christians start relying on political power to advance our causes is the second the secular left will start using that power against us.
They're already doing that.
We've been doing that for a while.
I've literally never lived in a world.
Why don't they
that
like the
wasn't
strawberry?
happening.
I make the Christian student groups hold their
What about the strawberry?
I thought they liked the strawberry. I didn't know they were going to make him wrong.
Oh,
Do they
they're
like
all
him?
wrong. That's the point.
Oh, okay.
No, yeah.
our meetings off campus at a sewage treatment facility.
I got arrested for saying Bible within 300 yards of a Planned Parenthood.
I failed math for assuming Pythagoras' gender.
We boo the Holy Trinity at our lacrosse games.
I bought my niece a Precious Moments Bible and got put on an FBI watch list.
I skipped a Sam Smith song on Spotify and got charged with a hate crime.
I'm having your bank account frozen right now.
But guys, imagine if they use that power against us.
Why are you the way you are?
It's a mystery, a puzzle that can never be solved, a riddle that can never be told.
Is it that you should have gotten a swirly 37 years ago but didn't?
Yeah, pretty much.
So there's the game show. Is that
Okay.
Christian nationalism? Yeah. So that's basically gives a good summary of the online discourse happening, where people
Okay.
on the left accuse everything on the right of being Christian nationalists. You have of course, the trad incel boys who are all for whatever is Christian nationalism or however they define it. Then you have the guys in the middle with the antinomian pushovers that are kind of like progressive Christians and don't really do anything other than just condemn Christians for using
The
any sort
strawberry?
of political aspect. Yeah, that's the strawberry.
I was
so
thoroughly confused about the strawberry mostly. I kind of got the left and the right thing going on. Yeah, I would say just stick with the scholarship, right? Like I think there is, it's not unheard of for like scholarly concepts, I guess, to be misunderstood in the public, but there's a lot of good work on this particular topic, right? Perry Whitehead, Paul Jew, and quite a few others. It's a good, do I have it here? I thought I had it somewhere. It's Stover and Fetzer's book on religious nationalism in a global perspective, I thought was really good, and kind of expanded this beyond the United States and showed like how to compare like Christian nationalism to nationalism and other religions too. Yeah, and anyway, I understand how people can get lost in that, but there are some solid resources if people are interested.
yeah, and that's that Christian nationalism. I hate the way this term is being defined now. It's constantly being defined in every wrong way possible. But yeah, I mentioned that at the beginning, so I thought we'd play it just for the fun of it and get your thoughts on it, because I promised Luke earlier I'd play it because I thought it was quite an interesting video. So, all right, well, anything else you want to say before we clock out here?
I probably should have prepared for a question like that. That's pretty standard, but did I? No, not. I mean,
No.
I think read more sociology. Read more sociology. See what we're doing.
Yeah.
I look. Okay, no. Here it is. Right, like here. I would say to anyone watching, like skeptic or Christian, my view is that of the multiple avenues, and I think we're kind of on a choose your own adventure journey. So generally, then, like if you're religious, right? Like I know most of your audience is Christian, and you don't like the characterization of like Christians as like bigoted and nationalist and all that sort of a thing. Like I think the first thing you do is you go out and make that future, right? Like maybe it sounds a little cheesy, but like I do think that's the path we're on. Is like we have to choose our own adventure here, and Christians could build a beautiful, could play a role in playing a beautiful future, or they could make some bad political choices. And I think for whatever skeptics are watching as well, like the same is open to you, right? Like there are movements within like secularist politics that are alarming, and you have a lot of great humanistic principles in your repertoire too. So I guess my final words to everyone is like make the right choice here. You get to make the future.
Right. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on, reviewing that debate. Again, we didn't really get good evidence that religion is bad for society, specifically Christianity or Judaism for that matter. Just so everyone knows, I'll be back live on my channel next week with Mike Licona. We're going to be talking about his new book, but we're also going to be responding to some cringy TikTok videos for the fun of it, since it's related to his book. And then after that, we'll be doing a response to Mindshift again, because there's so... Wow, that was interesting. But yeah, we'll take that one down pretty easily. But Than and I will schedule that pretty soon here. So thanks for coming, everyone. I'll see you on my channel next Wednesday.